In this video, I want to discuss the different kinds of flavour used in Magic the Gathering. Why, you might ask? Because I'm a nerd, and because it's interesting and rewarding to work out how this great game creates the amorphous but critical thing we call flavour. So, the original conceit of Magic the Gathering is that the player is a planeswalker, seeking to defeat an enemy planeswalker through casting spells, summoning creatures, and making use of artifacts they have at their disposal. In early Magic, most cards were a one-to-one representation of the actual spells the player, as planeswalker, could cast, the creatures they were able to summon, and the artifacts they were able to use. The most obvious card showing this literal flavour is Lightning Bolt. It represents the player planeswalker literally conjuring lightning to strike an opponent planeswalker or one of their creatures. In response, an opponent could play a card such as Counterspell, which represents the literal in-game response to that lightning bolt, nullifying it before it reaches its target. I'd characterise these kinds of flavour as diegetic. That is, they can be understood to literally exist in the ludonarrative game world that's being created as the players play the game. Still, even in early MTG, not all cards have this kind of one-to-one diegetic flavour. An example is False Orders, which allows you to control which creature an enemy creature blocks. Unlike Lightning Bolt or Counterspell, it's hard to believe that the player is delving into their spellbook to cast the False Orders spell, because if the player had the power to misdirect enemy creatures, it would not likely be so limited to merely making a creature block a different creature. On the other hand, if the false order represented the player somehow getting a false order through enemy lines by trickery or espionage, well, it's probably not even a spell at all. MTG was, of course, borrowing from Dungeons & Dragons, where characters have generalised skills or spells that can cover multitudes of situations, like Charm or Confusion. But of course, MTG is a card game with strict mechanical interactions, rather than a free-flowing role-playing game administered by a third-person dungeon master who is able to bend or break the game's rules if it's appropriate. MTG doesn't allow for the sort of narrative, character-driven effects that you find in D&D. Magic the Gathering cards must do a specific thing, and do it all the time. And so, False Orders marks a different kind of flavour. It focuses less on the literal thing the player as Planeswalker is doing in the ludonarrative, and more on the general effect that the player is somehow enacting. I'll call this kind of flavour effectual. That is, it's achieving some kind of effect that is within the power of the player Planeswalker to achieve. As time went on, Magic the Gathering became more interested, rather than merely alluding to stories on cards, to actually telling stories through the cards. This started to be a touchstone in Weatherlight, the story of a crew of the plane-hopping skyship Weatherlight as they quest to collect the ancient artifacts known as the Legacy in order to protect the multiverse from the predations of Yawgmoth and his Phyrexian hordes. Classic stuff. So, we start to see cards which represent not things that the player as Planeswalker is causing to happen, but cards depicting events taking place at the hands of other creatures or characters. For example, let's look at Desperate Gambit, representing Jared Capuchin fighting against the enormous Meraxis of Keld, who has just captured the character Stark, whom we see in the background rushing up with his knife aloft. Stark ends up stabbing Meraxis in the back and joins the Weatherlight crew, which we see in the card Debt of Loyalty. Both Desperate Gambit and Debt of Loyalty represent things that happened between specific characters at a specific time, at a specific place. But when these moments are invoked by the player, a stranger to the original events, what are we to understand from a ludonarrative perspective? The moment isn't being literally recreated, but rather, in playing the card, the player is invoking the affect, that is the gist, the impression of that moment, bestowing it upon other creatures. It begs the question, why does the Planeswalker player have access to these moments such that they can recall them and reproduce them? Well, I won't seek to answer that question today, but it certainly starts to really depart from the ludonarrative conceit of the Planeswalker battle. What's important with this kind of flavour is that it's looking to replicate the affect, the feeling, the narrative concept of a moment or event on the game state. So I'll call this kind of flavour affectual. I'd hazard a guess that this is the most prevalent flavour type now, but the research on that will need to wait for another day. I'll emphasise here that these are not exclusive categories. Cards can display all the kinds of flavour in differing proportions. For example, in Awakening of Vitu-Ghazi, the card literally creates a giant walking land elemental under the player's control, which mirrors an important story moment where Nissa Ravain animates the Selesnya Guild's sylvan stronghold of Vitu-Ghazi, only to be defeated by the forces of the dastardly Nicol Bolas. But of course, the player is not Nissa, and of course we know that because she has her own cards. So, I would say that this card is one where the flavour is actually all three flavours I've described already. It's diegetic. The player is literally animating Vitu-Ghazi onto their battlefield. It's effectual. It's not exactly clear how that animation is happening, but it's clear that it is happening. And it's affectual. That is, it is recalling the actual story moment enacted by a different character. After these first three categories of flavour, we have two more that are, perhaps, a bit more abstract. The fourth category is one which inevitably emerged in Magic the Gathering as the game started to refer to its own established logic and tropes, in addition to, or instead of, creating flavour from the ground up. For example, in MTG, a distinguishing feature of an elf is the ability to create mana, mostly because that's what the original elves, Llanowar elves, did, followed by dozens of their descendants over the last 30 years. Or, fire-breathing or spouting flame is now universally represented by an ability where red mana can be used to pump a creature's power. Or, charms. What began as a way of mechanically packing multiple small effects into a single card has now become a beloved piece of Magic flavour and lore. Charms are spread across planes and demonstrate, in a small way, how Magic is able to be used in the MTG multiverse, through the invocation of the symbol of a greater power, usually through a jewel or ornamented object. And when that symbol is invoked, it gives the user access to a selection of that greater power's magic, mechanically shown by the modal spell effects on the card. Whilst that flavour is well established now, I'd have to say that it's not at all obvious at first blush. It's flavour that only really works because of MTG's long history of using it. So essentially, this kind of flavour is reflexive, in that it only really makes sense if one knows of all the ways in which the flavour has been used in previous cards. Over time, such flavour might become second nature to a seasoned Magic player, but it doesn't necessarily jump off the card to those who are not so learned in all things Magic the Gathering. A modern example of reflexive flavour are the frogs from Bloomburrow. Their mechanical theme is caring about creatures going back to hand, which a moderately experienced MTG player might know as bouncing. And as we all know, frogs bounce. Get it? The lore explanation is that frogs in Bloomburrow are practitioners of a watery kind of teleportation magic, but essentially, the whole mechanical identity of this type is based on a reference to the well-established MTG jargon of bounce. Finally, there is a fifth category, and it's here that some of the most on-the-nose flavour would seem to belong. This kind of flavour seeks to evoke resonance with things from our world without finding a sufficient or satisfying anchor to the lore or flavour of the setting, or indeed the in-game Ludo narrative. Now, there's nothing wrong, necessarily, with cards that fall into this category. They're mostly just bad puns, but they do point to a certain flimsiness in design philosophy. by pointing so hard at our real world, cards like this threaten to take us out of the flavour or lore of the setting, or the Ludo narrative itself. I'll call this kind of flavour, euphemistically perhaps, metatextual. And I'm sure some of you really want me to hoe in on metatextual flavour and some of the cards that are the worst culprits, but that's not the point of this video. It may well be the point of another one. Anyway, there we have it. 5 kinds of flavour in MTG. Diegetic, effectual, affectual, reflexive, and metatextual. In future videos I plan on exploring these concepts more, but please remember these are just my categorizations, and they're really put as, hopefully, useful characterizations for future discussion of MTG flavour and how it works. They're not intended to be exclusive, and of course there is considerable overlap between them all. So, tell me what you think in the comments. This is my first in-depth long-form video, and if you like it, please do all the usual things so the algorithm spreads it around.